Hidden in the mountains of Yokosuka, April 1944. Deep within the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal in occupied Japan, a young ensign named Mitsuo Ota stood before a blank drafting table. Around him, the sounds of war echoed across the shipyard below. Distant explosions from American raids, the roar of testing engines, the clang of riveting hammers. But here, in this underground bunker, a different kind of sound filled the air, the sound of a man sketching the future of warfare. Ota held a pencil that would change the course of naval combat forever. He just didn't know it yet. He wasn't a famous admiral. He wasn't commanding fleets or leading squadrons. He was just a 30-year-old aeronautical engineer, educated at Tokyo's prestigious Aeronautical Research Institute, staring at a problem that seemed impossible. How do you destroy an enemy that you no longer have the speed to reach? Around his drafting table, other engineers whispered. They'd seen the reports. Japanese pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Zero fighters that once dominated the Pacific sky were being shot down by American F-6F Hellcats by the dozens. Conventional torpedo bombers that survived long enough to reach an American task force were being vaporized before they could release their weapons. The calculus of air combat had shifted, and Japan was losing the equation. The answer Ota sketched that day wouldn't be a faster airplane. It wouldn't be a better gun or a thicker armor plate. It would be something more radical, something that Japanese military leadership would eventually embrace out of pure desperation. It would be a flying bomb. And the man who would fly it would be a 23-year-old pilot named Lieutenant Hajime Fuji, who was about to write his name in history in a way he never expected. Why the Americans were winning by 1944, the Pacific War had shifted decisively against Japan. American shipyards weren't just building replacement vessels, they were building better vessels. American aircraft carriers operated with protective screens of destroyers and cruisers surrounding them like an armored shell. When American pilots got shot down, they were often rescued. When Japanese pilots got shot down, they were rarely seen again. American fighter pilots rotated home after completing their combat tours. They taught new pilots their tactics, their strategies, their hard-won knowledge of air combat. Japanese pilots, by contrast, flew until they died or were too wounded to continue. The kill ratio had flipped. What was once 10-1 in Japan's favor had become 1-10 against them. The Japanese Navy faced an arithmetic problem that had no solution through conventional means. They were bleeding pilots faster than any training program could replace them. Their entire strategy depended on exhausting American resources. Instead, American resources were exhausting them. A young ensign named Hideo Suzuki, who would later become one of the few surviving Okha pilots, remembered the feeling of watching his fellow pilots return with fewer and fewer of their formation. We watched the sky, he later recalled, and each day we watched fewer planes come home. Everyone knew what it meant. The enemy was winning, and we couldn't stop it. The solution, when it came, would horrify many of the engineers who created it. But by 1944, horror was becoming a common currency in the Pacific War. The desperate idea. Mitsuo Ota's concept wasn't entirely original. Germany was experimenting with piloted flying bombs. Japan had discussed manned kamikaze missiles for months. But Ota's design was different. It was purpose-built from the ground up, designed by engineers who understood that this machine would fly one mission, one way. His sketches showed a radical design that broke every convention of aircraft design. Length, just under 20 feet, shorter than the wingspan of a conventional fighter. Wingspan, barely 16 feet. Stumpy, stubby, unstable-looking construction. Aluminum fuselage, wooden wings, built cheap and fast to manufacture. The warhead, a 2,600-pound bomb buried in the nose, making up nearly 40% of the aircraft's total weight. The cockpit, a cramped sphere barely larger than a man's torso, where the pilot sat surrounded by fuel tanks and rocket motors. Propulsion. 3 solid-fuel rocket motors, fired sequentially, each one generating thrust for roughly 3 seconds. The beauty, if you could call it that, was in the speed. Once those rockets ignited, the Okha cherry blossom would accelerate from a gliding speed of 200 miles per hour to 650 miles per hour in level flight and over 900 miles per hour in a dive. No American anti-aircraft gunner had ever tracked anything that fast. No ship captain had ever maneuvered against a target moving at Mach 0.8. No air defense system on Earth could react fast enough. But there was a problem, multiple problems actually. The Okha had to be carried to the battle by a massive Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, a twin-engine transport aircraft that was essentially a flying target. The Betty was slow, ponderous, vulnerable, and the Okha could only fly 37 kilometers, 23 miles, from release point. This meant the Betty had to penetrate American radar screens, evade American fighter patrols, and arrive over a hostile task force while flying at 200 miles per hour into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. It was a suicide mission for 2 crews, not 1, 2. The Okha pilot would die by design, but the 8-man Betty crew would almost certainly die trying to reach the release point. The Navy says yes. When Okha presented his design in 1943, the reaction was mixed. Some officers called it brilliant, others called it insanity. The Navy was still confident in conventional aviation, but by 1944, as losses mounted and victory seemed to slip further away, the military high command became desperate. Sometimes desperation looks like wisdom when you're drowning. Approval was given. The Yokosuka Arsenal began construction. By early 1945, they'd built 155 operational Okha aircraft. The Kasumigara Naval Air Arsenal built another 600. Over 850 flying bombs sat in hangars and concealed bunkers across occupied Japan, waiting for pilots. The pilots selected for this mission came from a special unit called the Jinrai Butai, the Thunder God's Corps. They weren't volunteers in any conventional sense. They were officers who received orders, couched in terms that emphasized honor, sacrifice, and their duty to the emperor. What exactly they were being selected for became clear only when commanders gathered them and showed them the machine. The first time Lieutenant Hajime Fuji saw the Okha, he felt his stomach drop. It looked like something that shouldn't exist. The stubby wings seemed far too small to support the fuselage. The nose, where the massive warhead sat, gave the aircraft a top-heavy appearance. The cockpit, visible from the front, was barely large enough for one man. As Fuji walked around the airframe, he could see how the designers had sacrificed every non-essential system. No ejection seat, no landing gear, no escape hatch, no way out. An older pilot, Lieutenant Commander Noboru Iyo, stood beside Fuji and studied the machine with him. Iyo had survived dozens of conventional bombing missions. He understood the realities of air combat. He looked at the Okha and quietly said, "This is not an airplane. This is a coffin with rockets." The psychological preparation was minimal. Unlike conventional fighter pilots who underwent years of training to master formation flying, air combat tactics, and emergency procedures, Okha pilots received brief ground instruction and only 1 or 2 practice flights in an unpowered training variant. The training glider had a landing skid and used water ballast instead of explosives, but it was unstable and difficult to control. Several trainees were killed simply learning how to manage the machine. Fuji's training consisted of exactly 2 flights in the practice version. The first flight, he nearly crashed. The aircraft wanted to dive. Every instinct told him to pull back on the stick, but the instructors had warned him, pull back too hard on release day and you'll strike the Betty with your wing. The second flight was better. He learned to trust the controls, learned to feel the machine respond to tiny movements of the stick. 2 flights. Then they told him he was ready. "Ready for what?" he asked. Nobody answered directly, but he already knew. The waiting game. By March 1945, Lieutenant Hajime Fuji had been assigned to the Thunder God's Corps for 2 months. He and 16 other pilots lived in a barracks at Kanoya Air Base in southern Kyushu. They trained daily. They studied navigation charts showing American task force positions. They attended briefings where commanders spoke of glory and honor and the salvation of the Japanese nation. But mostly, they waited. Fuji's fellow pilots varied. Some were older, experienced combat flyers who'd survived dozens of conventional missions. Others were younger men, barely 20 years old, who'd received their pilot training only months before. But they all shared one thing. They knew they weren't coming home. Hideo Suzuki, another pilot in the same unit, later described the experience. "We ate together, we slept in the same room, but we didn't talk much about the mission. We talked about our families. We wrote letters. I wrote a letter to my mother every day for 2 months. I never knew if I'd send any of them." The military encouraged letter writing. It was part of the psychological preparation. Each pilot wrote his final words, not knowing when or if they would be sent. Some wrote philosophical letters. Some wrote confessions of doubt. Most wrote to their mothers, trying to explain the inexplicable. On March 17, 1945, the order came down. The first operational mission would launch the following day. American ships had been sighted near Okinawa. The Thunder Gods would finally fly. Fuji didn't sleep that night. None of them did. The first mission, March 18, 1945, 4:30 a.m., Kanoya Air Base. Darkness still filled the sky as 16 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers taxied toward the runway, each one carrying a single Okha strapped beneath its fuselage like a parasite. Lieutenant Hajime Fuji sat in his cockpit, a space so cramped that his shoulders nearly touched both sides of the fuselage. Above him, the Betty's twin engines roared to life, and the massive bomber began to roll. Through his tiny window, he could see the stars fading as dawn approached. He would never see this view again. His heart was pounding. His hands were sweating. He was 23 years old. The Betty became airborne, and the other bombers followed, a loose formation of 16, each carrying its cargo of death. The flight out would take hours. The Okha was designed to glide most of the way, conserving the limited rocket fuel for the final dive. Fuji had a dial in front of him showing which of his 3 rockets was armed and ready. He had controls for firing them sequentially. He had a small gun sight for aiming at the target. Everything else, radio contact with the Betty, navigation updates, target coordinates, would come through radio signals. The problem, American radar had been tracking the formation since it took off. At 6:45 a.m., American fighters were scrambled from a nearby airfield. By 7:30 a.m., they'd located the Japanese formation. F-6F Hellcats dove from above. The Zeros escorting the Bettys turned to intercept, but there were more American fighters than Japanese. Much more. The first Betty exploded in a fireball, hit by multiple bursts of .50 caliber machine gun fire. Fuji, riding in his coffin beneath the 4th Betty in the formation, felt the bump as his mother aircraft suddenly banked hard to evade. Another Betty went down, then another. Fuji's Betty was taking fire. He could hear the impacts, the tink-tink-tink of bullets striking aluminum fuselage just meters away. Someone in the bomber crew was screaming something, but Fuji couldn't make out the words over the roar of the engines and the rattle of machine gun fire. They weren't at the target yet. They were still 50 miles away from the American ships. The rockets couldn't be fired this far out. And the Betty was dying. "Disengage!" the command came over the radio. "All aircraft, return to base. We are disengaging." But Fuji couldn't disengage. He was locked inside the cockpit of the Okha. The controls that held him in place during the gliding phase were designed to prevent him from moving until separation. He was trapped. The Betty he was riding in took another burst of fire. The left engine caught fire. Through his tiny window, Fuji could see flames streaming from the nacelle. The bomber's pilot was fighting the controls, trying to keep the aircraft level and intact long enough to reach the coast. They didn't make it. The Betty went into a dive, and Fuji felt the terrible sensation of falling. He braced himself for impact. He could already feel the impact that would incinerate him along with the crew and the 2,600-pound warhead. But the pilot managed to level the wings at the last second. The Betty crashed into the ocean, and Fuji, still strapped into the Okha, went down with it. He didn't die immediately. The cockpit held together for a few seconds as the water rushed in. Then it was over. Of the 16 Bettys that launched that morning, only 3 survived to return to base. None of them were carrying an Okha that reached its target. 16 pilots were dead, 9 Okha pilots with them. Fuji was one of them. He was 23 years old. He'd never fired a shot in anger. His training flights in the practice version were the only times he'd ever actually piloted the aircraft. And it was only the beginning. March 19, 1945. Kanoya Air Base, 5:15 a.m. The weather was clear. The runway was empty. The remaining Okha pilots sat in the barracks, waiting for word on what happened to their brothers who took off yesterday. Most of them already knew. Rumors had been filtering back through radio chatter. 16 bombers sent, only 3 returning. None with an Okha that had reached its target. The barracks were silent in a way that only death creates. Ensign Hideo Suzuki sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. He'd written a final letter to his mother. It sat in a drawer, sealed, addressed, ready to be sent whenever the military decided his family should know he was gone. Except he wasn't gone. He was alive. His hands were shaking. The psychological reality of being a returned Okha pilot was a kind of living death. In Japanese military culture, there was no concept of retreat or return. A soldier either died completing his mission or he was a coward. There was no third option. If a special attack pilot returned without completing his mission, he faced profound shame, not just from the military, but from society itself. Letters to families would arrive accusing him of betrayal. Former friends would disappear. Teachers who'd taught him would turn away. The Bushido Code demanded absolute commitment. To return alive was to announce to the world that you'd failed in the most absolute way possible. Yet the first Okha operation had been an unqualified disaster, and some of them had survived, which meant that men like Hideo Suzuki now inhabited a space between life and death, belonging to neither world. Suzuki's roommate, Ensign Takeshi Yamamoto, sat beside him. Yamamoto was pale. His hands were also shaking. The 2 men looked at each other, but didn't speak. What was there to say? They'd trained together for months. They'd written letters together. They'd watched films about honor and sacrifice together. Now they were alive when they were supposed to be dead, and nobody seemed to know what to do with them. "They won't send us again," Yamamoto said quietly. "After this, they can't." Suzuki didn't respond, but he knew Yamamoto was wrong. The military machine didn't stop for failures. It accelerated. The man who whispered the truth. At the Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Captain Masanori Takahashi received the operational report and felt something shift inside him. Some internal machinery that had been grinding along under the weight of war suddenly seized. He'd served for 20 years. He'd believed in honor, in duty, in the rightness of Japanese military power. But he'd also been trained to analyze data, and the data staring at him from this report was incontrovertible. The Okha program had just killed 88 men to accomplish nothing. Not something valuable. Nothing. Takahashi read the report 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. 16 bombers launched. 0 reached their targets. 0 enemy ships sunk. 88 men dead. He walked to the office of Naval Commander Wataru Tanaka, the only other officer who'd understand what this meant. They spoke quietly, in the code officers had developed when discussing things they couldn't speak about openly. Because in 1945, Japan, speaking certain truths, could cost you your career, your freedom, or your life. "What's your assessment?" Tanaka asked. Takahashi closed the door before answering. "Failure, complete failure. The delivery system is fundamentally broken. The Okha is a coffin, and the Betty is a slower coffin carrying the first coffin. Tanaka's jaw tightened. He'd heard similar assessment from engineers at Yokosuka. What will High Command do? Cancel the program, Takahashi said, though he didn't believe it as he spoke. No, Tanaka replied. They won't. Can't. Too many admirals have staked their reputations on it. Takahashi knew Tanaka was right. He'd watched this pattern throughout the war, military leaders doubling down on failed strategies, because admitting failure meant admitting that everything they'd built their careers on was wrong. It was easier to sacrifice another 100 pilots than to sacrifice your honor. Then they'll accelerate, Takahashi said. Yes. The two men stood in silence. Outside, Tokyo burned from American firebombing. Refugees from the cities were beginning to flood the countryside. The war was clearly, obviously, mathematically lost. Everyone in High Command understood this. And yet the killing would continue. Why do we keep doing this? Takahashi asked. It was a dangerous question. Questioning the war, questioning military leadership, was considered defeatism. But he was tired of watching young men die for the glory of admirals. Tanaka didn't answer. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, even to a friend. The propaganda machine that couldn't stop within 48 hours of the first Okha failure, military censors in Tokyo were rewriting the story for public consumption. The official military communique, distributed to Japanese newspapers, read, "The special attack aircraft Okha was successfully launched on March 18th. Multiple aircraft engaged enemy targets. Significant damage confirmed." Every statement was false, but the newspapers printed it exactly as written, and by March 20th, headlines across Japan proclaimed victory to a desperate population. Civilians reading these headlines while their cities burned felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, the war could be won after all. The military leadership understood this psychological calculus perfectly. The Okha program wasn't just a weapon, it was a story. A narrative that allowed Japan to tell itself that it still had options, still had hidden capabilities, still had hope. As long as newspapers printed stories about cherry blossom victories, the Japanese people could believe the war wasn't lost. As long as the war seemed winnable to the public, military leaders didn't have to face calls for surrender. The propaganda served an internal function as much as an external one. It allowed admirals to tell themselves they were doing the right thing. The weight of knowledge. Back at Kanoya Air Base, Hideo Suzuki received a copy of the newspaper article about the Okha's success. He read it in stunned silence. He knew exactly how many Okha pilots had died. He knew exactly how many ships had been hit. He knew the article was a lie, and yet part of him wanted to believe it. Part of him wanted to believe that his brother pilots, the men he'd trained with, laughed with, shared fears with, had died for a reason, that their sacrifice had accomplished something, that the war might be won. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through training, knew better. The propaganda was designed to make people feel better about catastrophe. It was designed to make failure feel like victory. That night, Suzuki and Yamamoto sat on the edge of the base airfield, watching mechanics work on aircraft. The sound of the work, metal on metal, rivets being driven, engines being tested, felt abstract, surreal. These machines would carry more pilots to their deaths. These machines would consume resources and lives and produce nothing but graveyards. "Why don't they stop?" Yamamoto asked. It was the question that everyone was asking silently, but few dared speak aloud. "Because stopping would mean admitting they were wrong," Suzuki replied. "And the military doesn't admit being wrong." This was perhaps the most dangerous thought a Japanese officer could have in 1945. The realization that the system had become disconnected from reality, that it was consuming its own population in the service of preserving authority and honor rather than winning the war. Yamamoto didn't respond, but Suzuki could see the weight of understanding settle on him. Both men now understood something that few people did. They were going to die, and when they died, it would be in service to a lie. The engineer's nightmare. Mitsuo Ota, the designer of the original Okha, had begun having thoughts he couldn't share with anyone. In private conversations with junior engineers, conversations whispered in empty hallways, never in writing, he expressed doubts that few officers dared voice. "The problem isn't the Okha," he told one young engineer, barely 20 years old. "The Okha works. The problem is the delivery. The Betty can't get close enough. Even with rocket power, even at 900 miles per hour, the mother aircraft dies before release. The entire concept is broken." The engineer, a boy really, conscripted from engineering school at the last moment, looked terrified. Admitting the program was flawed was, technically, undermining military authority. It was defeatism. It could be reported. "We need to build a jet-powered variant," Ota continued, dropping his voice lower. "Something that doesn't need a mother aircraft. If we can design an Okha with enough fuel to fly 80 miles, that solves the problem." It was a reasonable engineering solution. It was also built on a psychological foundation of denial. The real problem wasn't that the Okha couldn't fly fast enough. The real problem was that the entire strategy was based on the false assumption that a mechanical solution existed for a strategic failure. There was no engineering answer to the fact that Japan had already lost the war. But Ota, like all men caught in the machinery of a failing system, looked for technical solutions because technical solutions felt achievable. They felt like they offered control and hope. The test flight, June 7, 1945. Test flight range near Yokosuka. Lieutenant Kazutoshi Nagano, 27 years old, strapped into the cockpit of the Model 22 Okha, the jet-powered variant. He'd flown it twice before, both times successfully, though both times he'd experienced the sensation of the aircraft being subtly wrong. The center of gravity felt too far aft. The controls felt sluggish. But both times he'd landed safely and reported the aircraft was acceptable. He was a military officer. He knew what was expected of him. You didn't report that a weapon was unsafe. You reported that it worked. The separation from the mother aircraft went smoothly. Nagano fired the jet engine. The aircraft should have accelerated into level flight for standard testing. Instead, the nose dropped suddenly, violently. Nagano's stomach lurched as gravity shifted. His hands moved to the control stick, but the aircraft wasn't responding. The nose kept dropping. The diving angle increased. 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees. Witnesses on the ground saw the Model 22 go nearly vertical, moving at tremendous speed. They later reported hearing the sound of the engine screaming, the jet turbines producing maximum thrust, but the aircraft was clearly out of control. Nagano had maybe 8 seconds to process what was happening: the aerodynamic imbalance, the fundamental structural flaw, the realization that he was going to die not as a hero making a choice, but as a victim of bad engineering and failed systems. The aircraft struck the ground at 400+ miles per hour in a remote valley. The explosion created a crater. There was nothing left of the aircraft, nothing left of pilot Nagano. His family never received his final letter. There was no body to bury. He simply ceased to exist, one more casualty in the machinery of war. The investigation revealed the problem. The jet engine's center of thrust was too far aft. When ignited, it created an aerodynamic imbalance that the aircraft couldn't correct. The Model 22 was aerodynamically unstable, a death trap by design. The natural response would have been to cancel the program immediately and redesign. But that would require admitting the design was fundamentally flawed. That would require admitting that engineers had made a catastrophic mistake. That would require honesty. Instead, military leadership classified the cause of Nagano's death as secret and ordered testing to continue with remaining pilots. The only victory, May 16, 1945. USS Manert El Abele, destroyer, Okinawa Defense Zone. Ensign Yoshiro Kondo, aged 21, sat in the cramped cockpit of his Okha and tried not to think about the fact that he'd received only 2 weeks of training. The entire program was moving faster now, desperate and frantic. There was no time for thorough preparation. There was barely time for basic instruction. He'd received 1 flight in a training variant. That was his entire flight training in the Okha. The Betty carrying him had been damaged by American fighters on the approach. 1 engine was on fire. The pilot was struggling to keep it level long enough to reach release point. Kondo could feel the vibrations, could sense the dying aircraft around him. The release came at 08:36 hours. The Okha separated and Kondo fired his rockets. For the first time, he experienced the surge of acceleration, 0 to 600 miles per hour, in seconds. The sky became a blur of motion and color and noise. Below, American gunners tracked him. They opened fire. Shells ripped through the Okha's thin aluminum skin. But at 600+ miles per hour, Kondo was moving faster than conventional weapons could track. He saw the destroyer below, USS Manert El Abele. He aimed the nose downward and squeezed the fire control. The impact, the explosion, the end. The destroyer went down in less than a minute. 79 American sailors died. It was the only significant success the Okha program would achieve. 1 ship sunk for the life of 1 pilot and the crew of 1 bomber. But Kondo never knew if he'd succeeded. The explosion destroyed him along with his target. In some ways, that mercy, never knowing failure, never having to live with the knowledge that his sacrifice had been wasted, was the only positive aspect of the entire program. The question that nobody could answer. By June 1945, officers like Captain Masanori Takahashi found themselves trapped in a psychological bind that they had no words to articulate. They understood at a deep level that the war was lost. They understood that continuing the Okha program was sending pilots to their deaths for no strategic purpose. They understood that the entire system had become unmoored from reality. But what could they do? Speak the truth? That was defeatism. Risk being reported, transferred, or worse. Resign and protest? That would accomplish nothing and would cost them their influence. Refuse to participate? They were military officers. Refusal was not an option. So they continued. They processed reports. They attended meetings. They watched the machinery grind on, knowing it was crushing their own countrymen. This was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the Okha program, not the deaths themselves, but the knowledge, shared by military leaders, that the deaths were meaningless and would continue anyway. It was a special form of torture, the torture of complicity in a system you couldn't stop. Suzuki and Yamamoto, still alive, still waiting for their next mission, experienced a different psychological torture, the knowledge that they were going to die, and that their deaths would accomplish nothing. Yet the system that would kill them demanded they maintain honor, dignity, and discipline right up to the moment of death. In the final analysis, the Okha program wasn't really a weapon designed to win a war. It was a symptom of a culture that had trapped itself in denial, a culture where admitting failure was more frightening than accepting catastrophe. The letter, June 15, 1945, Rechlin Air Base, Germany. Test pilot Helmut Schräder sat at a desk in an underground bunker, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote. At 31 years old, he was supposed to be a hero. Over 200 combat missions, 18 confirmed kills, the Luftwaffe's highest honors. A man marked for immortality through sacrifice. Instead, he was about to commit what the military would call betrayal. The letter he was writing was addressed to Jagdgeschwader 4 Command, the fighter wing he'd been assigned to support in their final desperate battles. And in it, he was going to refuse a direct order. "I respectfully request formal exemption from the RAM Commando program," he wrote, his words careful and precise. "I have completed over 200 operational missions. I am prepared to continue flying combat sorties in conventional fighter roles. However, I cannot in good conscience deliberately sacrifice myself and my aircraft when such sacrifice serves no legitimate strategic purpose." It was a letter that could have ended his career. It could have gotten him court-martialed. In Nazi Germany, with the Gestapo still active, even as the Reich crumbled, it could have gotten him executed. But Helmut Schräder was betting on something, that the German military machine, even in its death throes, still retained enough rationality to listen to a hero's objection. The same order, different responses. On the same day that Schrader wrote his letter of dissent in a German bunker, Hideo Suzuki received orders at Kanoya Air Base for his second Okha mission. Unlike Schrader, Suzuki had no mechanism for dissent. Unlike Schrader, he would never write a letter objecting to his own death. The difference wasn't that Suzuki was braver. The difference was that two empires, both crumbling, both desperate, had engineered their cultures in completely opposite ways. Germany, for all its Nazi horrors, had inherited a centuries-old Prussian military tradition that allowed competent officers to argue with their superiors. Even under Hitler, the general staff system preserved theoretical channels for dissent. An officer could argue his case and expect a rational discussion about strategy, even if he might be punished for that discussion. Japan had engineered itself the opposite way. For centuries, Bushido culture had taught that questioning a superior was dishonor, not punishment, dishonor. Refusal to follow orders wasn't just a military crime, it was a spiritual death from which the only recovery was actual death. To refuse an Okha mission meant social annihilation that extended to your entire family. So when Suzuki received his orders, he accepted them quietly. When Schrader received equivalent orders, he wrote a letter. One empire allowed refusal, the other had designed refusal out of the possibility space entirely. The meeting, June 17, 1945. Luftwaffe Command Center, Eastern Germany. Schrader sat across from Oberstleutnant Wilhelm von Kürten, the commanding officer of JG4's newly activated RAM Commando unit. Kürten was 40 years old, exhausted, and completely unmoved by Schrader's arguments. "You're refusing a direct order," Kürten said flatly. "You understand what that means." "I understand it's my right to object to an ineffective strategy," Schrader replied. His hands were steady now. He'd had 3 days to practice this conversation. "Sir, I'm suggesting that my experience, 200-plus missions, is more valuable to the war effort than my death in a ramming attack." Kürten studied the pilot for a long moment. The general was in an impossible position. Schrader was right technically. Ramming attacks were a mathematical disaster. One fighter worth millions of Reichsmarks, flown by an experienced pilot, traded for maybe one bomber. It was the mathematics of desperation, not strategy. But desperation was all they had left. "What do you propose?" Kürten asked, and in asking that question, he was already conceding ground. A Japanese commander would never ask. He would simply order execution or transfer and move on. Kürten was engaging in the very act that German military culture allowed, but Japanese culture had eliminated: rational debate about a failed strategy. "Transfer me to a conventional fighter unit," Schrader said. "I can continue flying operational sorties. My combat experience, targeting, evasion, formation tactics all remain valuable. But direct my skills toward missions that have strategic purpose, not symbolic sacrifice." Kürten didn't respond immediately. Behind him, Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The Red Army was less than 100 kilometers away. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. And in this moment, the German officer had to decide: follow the logic of desperation or allow reason one final voice. "I'll submit your request up the chain," Kürten said finally. "But Schrader, if they force this issue, you need to understand what you're risking." "I understand, sir." By war's end, Helmut Schräder had not been forced to join the RAM Commando. He flew conventional fighter missions until May 1945. He survived the war. The refusal that never happened. Hideo Suzuki never had this conversation. In Japanese military culture, there was no Kürten willing to engage in rational debate about strategy. There was only obedience or dishonor, death or social annihilation. Suzuki accepted his orders for a second Okha mission. He never wrote a letter. He never asked to be transferred. The cultural machinery of Japan, centuries of Bushido tradition, contemporary military hierarchy, and family honor had locked him into a path that offered only one ethical conclusion: obedience unto death. This wasn't cowardice on Japan's part or wisdom on Germany's. Both empires were monstrous in their own ways. But Germany's monstrosity had built-in escape hatches. Japan's had engineered the escape hatches out. The engineer who said no. The same week that Schrader was submitting his transfer request, Willy Messerschmitt, the aircraft designer whose name was on every fighter in the Luftwaffe, received an unusual request from High Command. The generals wanted him to design a new fighter aircraft, not for conventional air combat, but for suicide missions. Specifically, they wanted something small, light, cheap, essentially disposable. A machine that could be built rapidly and piloted by partially trained pilots on one-way missions. The logic was the mathematics of desperation. If you can build fighters cheaply enough, you can throw them away like ammunition. Messerschmitt listened to the specification. Then he said something extraordinary for a German aircraft designer. "You're asking me to design a machine that ensures pilots will die. I've spent my career designing machines to keep pilots alive. I won't do this." The general left. The project never happened. This conversation, and the fact that Messerschmitt could refuse without being executed, is perhaps the most revealing moment in the entire comparison. Why the difference? The fundamental difference between Germany and Japan in 1945 wasn't technology or strategy. It was culture's relationship to dissent. German military tradition, dating back to the Prussian General Staff System, was built on the assumption that intelligent debate strengthened military strategy. Even under Hitler, even with the SS and Gestapo executing political prisoners, this tradition persisted in pockets. Officers could argue, engineers could refuse. The system was designed to filter out at least some of the worst ideas through rational debate. Japanese military tradition was the opposite. It was built on the assumption that absolute obedience strengthened military unity. Questioning a superior wasn't debatable strategy. It was spiritual corruption. By 1945, this system had evolved to the point where refusal was literally unthinkable. Not prohibited. Unthinkable. The different calculations. Helmut Schräder calculated, if I refuse, I risk my career, possibly court-martial, possibly my freedom. But I keep my life. The system allowed him to make this calculation. It was a rational choice with rational consequences. Hideo Suzuki calculated, if I refuse, I lose my family's honor, my nation's respect, my own social existence. My parents will receive letters calling them cowards. Former teachers will publicly denounce me. I will become a ghost while alive. He was locked into a system where the only ethical choice within the logic of that system was obedience unto death, not because the system was more effective, but because the system had constructed itself to eliminate refusal as a viable option. The factories. By June 1945, both nations' aircraft production was collapsing. Germany's remaining factories were underground or dispersed. Japan's factories were still producing Okha aircraft by the hundreds, even though everyone in leadership knew the war was lost. But there's a subtle difference in how the two nations processed this collapse. In Germany, some officers had already begun the psychological work of accepting reality. Some engineers were already considering how to preserve their designs for the post-war world. Some military leaders were already thinking about surrender. The system was failing, but it was at least beginning to acknowledge that failure. In Japan, military leadership was still issuing operational orders as if strategic victory were somehow possible. The Okha program was still accelerating. The propaganda machine was still claiming victories. The culture had constructed itself so completely that acknowledging reality was impossible. Survival and legacy. Helmut Schräder survived the war. He lived until 1987. In interviews in his final years, he reflected on his refusal. Honor is not in dying for a failed strategy. Honor is in having the courage to say when a strategy is wrong and then accepting the consequences of that statement. This philosophy would have been not just unthinkable in Japan, it would have been unspeakable. To say such a thing would mark you as spiritually corrupted. Willy Messerschmitt also survived. The post-war Germany that emerged, for all its moral reckoning, at least created space for someone to say, "I refuse to participate in that madness, and I stand by that refusal." Messerschmitt rebuilt his aircraft company. He spoke openly about his refusal. Mitsuo Ota, designer of the Okha, survived as well. But the post-war Japan that emerged never created genuine space for him to discuss his doubts about the program. Instead, the Okha was transformed into a symbol of sacrifice and national spirit. Ota lived with the weight of having designed a machine he knew was flawed, but he never publicly acknowledged those doubts. The post-war narratives were different. Germany allowed its people to confront what went wrong. Japan buried it under honor and sacrifice. The final difference. Both Germany and Japan ended the Second World War in complete, undeniable defeat. Both had to confront the catastrophe of their military systems. Both had to process the fact that they'd squandered millions of lives and cultural resources on failing strategies. But Germany had mechanisms, imperfect, incomplete, but real, for individuals to object and survive. When the system became indefensible, individual voices could occasionally speak truth. Japan had engineered itself into a cultural machine that had eliminated mechanisms for objection. The system didn't just discourage dissent, it had made dissent unthinkable. Every pilot like Hideo Suzuki was trapped in a system where the only ethical choice, within the logic of that system, was obedience. The Okha wasn't primarily a failure of technology or strategy. It was a failure of culture to retain any mechanism for saying no. Germany built systems that at least allowed heroes like Schrader to refuse. Japan built systems that eliminated refusal from the possibility space entirely. And when empires start eliminating the possibility of refusal, they stop listening to reason altogether. The silence of August 15th, 1945. 12 p.m., noon, Japan, Standard Time. The radio broadcast was transmitted across Japan on frequencies that had been reserved for military announcements. Most of the nation had never heard Emperor Hirohito's voice before. The sound was strange, formal, almost otherworldly, as if it came from a different realm entirely. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. He spoke of accepting the inevitable. He never used the word defeat. Instead, he spoke of bearing the unbearable and enduring the unendurable. It was a language designed to preserve honor while announcing catastrophe. Hideo Suzuki heard the broadcast at Kanoya Air Base, sitting with the other surviving Okha pilots in a radio room that smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. Around him, men who were supposed to be dead were listening to their emperor tell them to live. The war was over. The empire had fallen. But more profoundly, the entire psychological framework that had structured their lives had just been invalidated by the voice of the emperor himself. Suzuki was 23 years old. For the past 8 months, he'd been trained for death. The military had created an entire system designed around the assumption that he would die. His family had received conditional notification of his death. His childhood teachers had heard of his sacrifice. The social machinery of Japan had been mobilized around the expectation of his death. And now, in the space of a broadcast that lasted a few minutes, all of that had been suspended. He would live. But what would that life mean? Who was he supposed to be in a system that had defined his entire existence around the expectation of his non-existence? 3,000 kilometers away, in an American POW camp near the Rhine, Helmut Schräder received word of Japan's surrender through whispered conversation between guards. Germany had already fallen on May 7th. The war in Europe had been over for months. But the war in the Pacific had continued, and with it, the justification for the RAM Commando program, the justification for Schrader's refusal. He was alive. He was a prisoner. But he was also proven right. The war had ended without him having to fly a suicide mission. The system had collapsed, and he had survived both the war and his own refusal. But survival for both men carried a weight that neither had anticipated. The systems that had shaped them had collapsed. They now had to figure out how to live in the ruins of empires, to rebuild identities that the war had either tried to kill or had never allowed to fully form. The machinery of reconstruction. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, Allied occupation forces began moving through the country. American soldiers entered Japanese cities. Military bases were disarmed. The machinery of war, so recently operational, was being converted into machinery of occupation. At military bases like Kanoya, Okha pilots and their crews faced a peculiar psychological state. They were alive, but survival had been conditional. The system that sustained them, the military hierarchy, the framework of duty and honor, was being dismantled around them. Without that structure, many pilots felt adrift. The post-war Japanese government faced an immediate problem. What narrative would explain the Okha and kamikaze? Option 1. Tell the truth. The Okha was a weapon created out of desperation. Military leadership, facing certain defeat, designed a system that eliminated choices for pilots. The program was a symptom of systemic failure, not a sign of spiritual power. Option 2. Transform the narrative. Rewrite the Okha as a symbol of sacrifice and spiritual power. Tell the story of pilots who chose death for honor rather than pilots who were locked into systems of death. Convert tragedy into meaning. By 1946, Japan had chosen Option 2. Within a few years, the narrative had solidified in the collective memory. Kamikaze pilots were not desperate men sent to their deaths by a failing system. They were spiritual warriors who'd chosen sacrifice for honor. They were not victims of military madness. They were heroes of a lost cause. Hideo Suzuki watched this transformation happen around him. The shame he'd expected to carry, the shame of surviving when he was supposed to die, gradually transformed into something else. By the 1950s, as the Allied occupation ended and Japanese nationalism reasserted itself, survivor pilots like Suzuki found themselves being invited to speak at schools, to share their experiences, to participate in the mythologization of their own suffering. It was a profound relief. But it was also a profound lie, and Suzuki knew it. Suzuki after the war, 1945-1980. After the surrender, Hideo Suzuki spent 8 months in an internment camp run by the Allies. When he was released in early 1946, he returned to Tokyo on foot, walking through the burned remains of his city. His family home was gone, destroyed by firebombing in March 1945. His father was alive. His mother had perished in the raids. Suzuki was 24 years old. He'd been trained to die. Now he had to learn how to live. In the immediate post-war years, being a kamikaze survivor was psychologically ambiguous. Some people treated survivors with reverence as witnesses to national sacrifice. Others avoided them, reminders of Japan's catastrophe and the military system that had done this to its own youth. Some, quietly, blamed them. If your generation had fought better, we wouldn't be occupied. Suzuki found work as an engineer with a small electronics manufacturing company. He took the technical skills that had been developed in him during his Okha training, the precise calculations, the understanding of aeronautics and physics, and redirected them toward peacetime applications. By 1950, he was managing a small team. By 1960, he'd been promoted to department head. On the surface, Suzuki rebuilt his life successfully. He married in 1952. He had 2 children, a son in 1953 and a daughter in 1956. He bought a small house in a Tokyo suburb. He attended his children's school events. By external measures, he was a functional post-war Japanese citizen. But something inside him remained broken in ways that never fully healed. In private conversations with close friends, conversations that rarely happened, and almost never with his wife or children, Suzuki would sometimes try to articulate what he was feeling. A colleague who knew him for decades later remembered one such conversation in the early 1960s. Hideo told me once that he felt like he was living a life that wasn't supposed to be his. He said, "I was prepared to die. I trained for death. My family was told I was dead, and then suddenly the system collapsed, and I was alive, and no one knew what to do with me. Not the military, not society, not even myself." By the 1970s, as Western researchers and historians began studying the kamikaze phenomenon, Suzuki was occasionally contacted for interviews. He was polite, cooperative, careful in his responses. He would describe the aircraft. He would discuss the training. He would talk about the honor and sacrifice. But he never discussed the desperation. He never discussed how the system had locked him into a path that offered only death or dishonor. He never discussed how survival had felt like a kind of betrayal, survival of a system that had designed him for death. The narrative of honor and sacrifice had become so dominant in post-war Japanese society that speaking against it felt like desecrating the dead. So Suzuki said what was expected, and he lived with the knowledge that his public story didn't match his internal reality. In 1982, researchers from the University of Tokyo approached Suzuki for a formal recorded interview about his Okha experience. He was 60 years old by then. He agreed to participate. During the interview, when asked directly about his feelings when he received the order for his second Okha mission, Suzuki paused for a long moment. The tape recorder was running. The researcher was waiting. And in that pause, for just a moment, Suzuki seemed to be considering saying something true, something that violated the official narrative. Then he said, "It was an honor to receive such an order from my emperor and military." The researcher moved on to the next question. The moment passed. The official narrative was reinforced. Schrader. After the war, 1946-1987, Helmut Schräder was released from the American POW camp in spring 1946. Germany was a shattered nation, occupied by 4 powers, subjected to denazification investigations. Military service wasn't automatically dishonorable, but it was suspicious. Schrader's record, when examined by the occupying authorities, was complex. 200-plus combat missions, multiple honors, but also, crucially, evidence of his refusal to fly the Ram Commando suicide mission. The refusal, which could have been held against him as insubordination during the war, became in the post-war context a mark in his favor. It suggested he'd resisted when he could have simply obeyed orders. Schrader became an engineer, like Suzuki. He worked for a small aircraft components company. He rebuilt his career. He married in 1948. He had 3 children. By external measures, he followed a similar post-war trajectory to Suzuki. But the cultural context was different. Germany had not built a unified narrative of honor around its military sacrifice. Instead, post-war Germany had embarked on a painful process of denazification and historical reckoning. It was considered important, morally necessary, to confront what the military had done. Refusal became something that could be spoken about, analyzed, understood. Schrader was able to speak openly about his decision. He gave occasional interviews. He contributed to historical accounts. He never presented his refusal as particularly heroic. He presented it as necessary and rational. In 1979, a German documentary filmmaker approached Schrader about being interviewed for a film on Luftwaffe pilots and their experiences. Schrader agreed. In the filmed interview at age 65, he discussed his refusal of the Ram Commando order with calm clarity. "The tactic made no sense. We were losing. Everyone knew we were losing. To ask experienced pilots to deliberately sacrifice themselves served no strategic purpose. I submitted my request for transfer. My commanding officer allowed it. That is how the system should work. There should be space for reasonable objection to unreasonable orders. The filmmaker asked, "Don't you think that was a form of disobedience?" Schrader paused. Then, "Disobedience would have been if I refused to follow a legitimate military order in a legitimate strategic context. What I did was request transfer from an illegitimate tactic. That's not disobedience, that's sanity." This statement, made by a German officer in the post-war era on film for posterity, would have been literally impossible for a Japanese officer to make. The cultural machinery that had eliminated refusal during the war continued to eliminate honest assessment afterward. Schrader lived until 1987. He gave more interviews in his final years. He became known as one of the few German pilots who'd openly discussed refusal. When he died, German historical societies acknowledged him as an important voice in post-war reckoning. Museums and objects. In 2003, an American museum obtained a restored Yokosuka MXY-7 Okha aircraft. It had been recovered from an island where it had crashed during a test flight decades earlier. After extensive restoration, it was placed on display in a climate-controlled exhibition hall. The museum's exhibit notes read, "The Yokosuka MXY-7 Okha was a revolutionary rocket-powered aircraft designed and built by the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. Over 800 were constructed. The aircraft represented cutting-edge aeronautical engineering and innovative design solutions. The Okha had one of the highest-powered flight speeds of any aircraft in the war." The exhibit mentioned that 56 Okha aircraft completed operational missions. It mentioned that one American destroyer was sunk. It did not mention Hideo Suzuki. It did not mention Hajime Fuji, who died in the first mission. It did not mention Kazutoshi Nagano, whose test flight ended in a crash. It did not mention the 350-plus Japanese personnel who died in the program. It did not mention the desperation that created it. The object remains. The human stories get abstracted into technical specifications. Occasionally, visitors stop at the display. Some read the plaque, most don't. A few ask the docents questions. Most walk on to the next exhibit. The Okha sits quietly, no longer dangerous, stripped of its warhead, its meaning compressed into a brief wall text that emphasizes innovation while omitting context. The narrative that gets written. The post-war narratives of Germany and Japan diverged fundamentally. In Germany, the Ram Commando was remembered as a sign of military desperation. Books were written analyzing it. Films examined it. The narrative acknowledged military failure and systemic madness. Space was created for veterans like Schrader to say, "This was wrong. I was right to refuse." In Japan, the Okha was incorporated into a narrative of sacrifice and spiritual power. School children learned about kamikaze pilots as examples of honor and dedication. The narrative transformed desperation into meaning. Space was never created for veterans like Suzuki to say, "This was desperation. We were trapped." One nation allowed honest reckoning. The other allowed mythologization. Neither approach was perfect. Germany's reckoning was incomplete and sometimes self-serving. Japan's mythologization allowed the society to process trauma in ways that denial might not have. But one allowed individual truth-telling. The other did not. What systems do. Over the course of 4 chapters spanning from 1944 to 1945 to the decades that followed, we've watched 2 empires respond to military failure in profoundly different ways. But the key lesson isn't about which response was better. The key lesson is about what systems do to human choice. Japan engineered a system that didn't just discourage dissent, it eliminated dissent as a psychological possibility. It did this not through overt coercion, but through the subtler power of culture. It constructed a framework where refusal was spiritually impossible. Hideo Suzuki couldn't refuse an Okha mission not because he'd be shot, but because refusal meant social annihilation that extended to his entire family. The system made refusal unthinkable. Germany, even under Hitler, preserved pockets of space where individual choice could operate. Helmut Schräder could refuse. Willy Messerschmitt could refuse. They could suffer consequences, career damage, social ostracism, possibly worse. But the act of refusal was at least thinkable as an option. Neither system was humane. Both were preparing men for war and death. But one had engineered itself to allow the possibility of no. The other had engineered no completely out of the system. This has implications far beyond World War II. It's about how human systems either allow or eliminate space for individual moral agency. It's about whether institutions are designed to filter out catastrophic ideas through debate and dissent, or whether they're designed to enforce catastrophic ideas through the elimination of dissent. 50 years later, Two Old Men, 1995. A researcher studying post-war reconciliation contacted both Helmut Schräder and Hideo Suzuki. It was understood that Suzuki's health was declining. Both men, now in their early 70s, agreed to brief interviews for a comparative study. Helmut Schräder spoke in his home in Frankfurt, sitting in a comfortable chair, his hands folded in his lap. He was asked about his refusal of the Ram Commando order. His response was direct. "I've lived 50 years since that decision. I had a career, I had a family, I had grandchildren, I had a life. If I had flown that ramming mission, I would have been dead in 1945. My family wouldn't exist. My grandchildren wouldn't exist. The system allowed me to make a choice, and I made the choice to live. I'm grateful for that." He was asked if he regretted his refusal, if he considered it a betrayal of his comrades. "My comrades who flew the ramming missions were brave men, but bravery in service of a lost cause isn't virtuous. It's tragic. I survived. I lived to see my nation reunite. I lived to see my children grow up and have children of their own. That's a greater gift than any military honor could ever be." Hideo Suzuki spoke in his home in Tokyo, sitting in a small room overlooking a garden. His health was visibly failing. He had less than 2 years left to live. He was asked about his experience as an Okha pilot, about accepting orders for missions he knew would likely be suicide. His response was careful. "I was honored to receive the orders of my emperor and military leadership. The Okha was a symbol of our nation's commitment to victory despite overwhelming odds." But then, unexpectedly, he added something. "I was 23 years old. I had never been given any choice in anything. The military made all my choices. My family made all the choices before that. I went where I was sent. I did what I was told. There was no moment when I could say no without destroying myself and my family. So I didn't say no. I said yes." The interviewer asked, "Do you think that was the right choice?" Suzuki was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I lived. That's all I can say. I lived." After the interview ended, Suzuki walked the researcher to the door. As they stood in the entryway, he said something he'd never said publicly before. "The system was designed so that I couldn't refuse, but I wonder sometimes what my life would have been if I could have. I'll never know." He closed the door. The researcher heard him coughing in the other room. Hideo Suzuki died in January 1997. Helmut Schräder lived until 2003. Both had survived the systems that tried to kill them or trap them. But they lived in different narratives, with different freedom to speak their truths. The final weight. The Okha was never going to win the war. Helmut Schräder understood this from the moment he saw the specifications. Hideo Suzuki understood it at some level, even if he couldn't articulate it in the system he lived in. But one man could refuse, the other couldn't. And that difference, that single difference in whether refusal was psychologically possible, shaped the rest of their lives. It determined not just whether they lived, but how they were allowed to understand their own survival. The Okha wasn't primarily a failure of technology or strategy. It was a failure of culture to retain any mechanism for saying no. Japan had engineered itself into a system so complete that stepping back from the abyss was literally unthinkable. Germany, for all its horrors, had preserved enough space for at least some people to step back. And when empires allow that space, when they build systems that permit dissent, even at the cost of defeating their own policies, they leave room for human beings to remain human. When empires eliminate that space, they turn humans into functions of the system, and the weight of surviving that transformation never fully lifts.